Okay, so I heard a few things over on the tables over here that people were slightly surprised about, that were unexpected. I think you mentioned the fact that the owner let them have the donkey. Yeah, that is surprising. Anything else that you've found in this story that you thought perhaps shouldn't be there or were surprised by? Andrew?
The emphasis that the donkey had not been ridden.
Yeah, so the donkey had never been ridden. You wouldn't necessarily expect Jesus to choose a completely unbroken animal to ride into Jerusalem on. Yeah. Anything else unexpected in this story?
There's a sentence about Christmas in there.
A sentence about Christmas?
Yes.
Ooh, do tell.
Peace in heaven and glory in the highest.
Yeah, so that's right. So it echoes, doesn't it, what the angel said when Jesus was born. So we should be thinking about other entrances into the world of Jesus. Anything else unexpected? Let's have a think, shall we, for a moment about the crowd. We know that the crowd was made up of people who had heard about Jesus, who'd been following him, who'd seen him do quite a lot of exciting and amazing things. They'd witnessed him miraculously feeding thousands of people, healing the sick, giving sight to the blind, even raising the dead. So they knew that there was something special about this man. They'd been following him around, and I think that they hoped, or at least many of them hoped, that he was the one that their scriptures had said would save them from the Romans. I think this is a bit like a parade, isn't it? I think if they'd had banners as he came into Jerusalem, they might have been holding up signs that said things like "Save us," or "Down with the Romans," or "Make Israel strong again." Because they wanted, at that time, someone that was going to come in and fight their battles. They wanted a king. They wanted a warrior king, really. They wanted someone who was going to show strength. And so they had some expectations. And Jesus came to Jerusalem. And they heralded him as a king. We heard them shouting, didn't we? Praising him as king. And yet, he doesn't enter Jerusalem in any way in this story like a warrior would, does he? He doesn't ride on a giant stallion, elevated above the people in a show of strength and force and power. He doesn't come riding in on some kind of chariot, but on a colt. And as Andrew quite rightly pointed out, not just even a donkey, but an unbroken, unridden animal. Something simple, something lowly, something innocent, and something borrowed. He chose the transport for this triumphal entry of a servant or of a poor person, certainly not of a king. I wonder if you were choosing transport for a dramatic moment, maybe when you were arriving at your prom, or if you were coming as a king, what would you choose to arrive in? Perhaps, a fancy car. Perhaps something noisy and gregarious and quite dramatic. We saw the king on his coronation arriving in something incredibly glitzy, didn't we? Not modern, but really, really quite unusual. Perhaps that's what we might expect. But Jesus does something surprising. He chooses something humble. And he chose that colt not because it was the only thing available, not because it was all that he could get, but he intentionally sent his disciples out ahead of him, knowing where this colt was going to be, knowing what he wanted, and knowing what he intended. And I think in that moment, he was sending an unexpected but very clear message before he even said a word to the people. He was saying, I'm here. You knew I was coming, but my kingdom isn't what you expect it to look like. Things aren't going to be like you anticipate. And in this entry into Jerusalem, at this most significant of moments in Jesus' life, he's laying the foundations really clearly for what is going to come next. And instead of treading a path of power and of conquest, he rides in on that unbroken colt, treading a path of peace, signifying that he's come not to conquer, but to surrender, not to fight, but to restore. He's come to forgive. And as Jesus rides into Jerusalem, he's recognized as king by the crowds. He's recognized that he's someone who comes in the name of the Lord. But then there's another unexpected confrontation. Some Pharisees, those religious leaders, are affronted by what on earth is going on. They're affronted by Jesus' arrival, and they're certainly affronted by the way in which the disciples are heralding him. And so they say, "Tell your disciples to be quiet." In fact, they rebuke him, don't they, in the text? Now, maybe they're worried about stirring up trouble. Maybe it's because Jesus wasn't at all what they wanted for a king or a savior. But Jesus replies in another unexpected way. He says, if they keep quiet, the stones themselves will cry out. Which seems like quite a ridiculous claim, doesn't it? I think what he's saying is that even creation knows that something is about to change. And there's another unexpected element to this story, isn't there? Because those people, those crowds that in this moment are praising him, are saying Hosanna, recognizing him as king, in a few short days are going to be saying something completely different. They're going to be calling for Jesus to be crucified. Why? Well, because Jesus doesn't fit their expectations. He didn't come to overthrow the Romans. He didn't chase after power or wealth. He didn't come to build an empire. Instead, he reached out to the poor, to the lost, to the broken, and to the forgotten. And he challenged pride, and he called people to love their enemies. And that just isn't what anybody was expecting or wanting in a king. And I wonder, on this Palm Sunday, if we need to look at ourselves and to wonder if sometimes we're a bit like that crowd. We recognize that Jesus is somebody special. And we may even know in our heads what kind of king he says he is. And yet we still want something different from him. We expect that Jesus is going to be a kind of king who meets our needs as we say and when we say, who realizes our expectations. And then, like the crowd, when Jesus doesn't do what we want in the way that we want, perhaps when he doesn't answer our prayers just as we've expected, sometimes when he doesn't make things happen for us even when we haven't talked to him about it, we get despondent and angry and frustrated and cross and turn on him, reject him, just like that crowd does. So perhaps the unexpected confrontation in this passage for us is to ask ourselves what kind of king we are expecting Jesus to be. Do we want him to be someone who fixes all our problems? Or do we want him to be someone who changes us from the inside out? Because Jesus is that second kind of king. He doesn't promise to comfort or to control, but he promises transformation. And so that's both unexpected, challenging, but also absolutely amazing. One of the drawbacks that we have, I think, when we meet as church only once a week, particularly at Easter, is that we can really easily jump from today, Palm Sunday, as Jesus comes into Jerusalem, to Easter Sunday, when everything's done and it's all exciting and wonderful again. And then we lose the significance of what happens day by day on this week, this Holy Week. When we accompany Jesus into Holy Week, we see that this entry into Jerusalem is only the start of a journey that is much more unexpected and has much bigger implications for each one of us and for the whole of the human race than perhaps we anticipate. If we are willing to take time to listen to his teaching, consider his actions and hear what is said, notice what is left unsaid, reflect on what occurs each day, then I think we will begin to see that Jesus' kingship is so much more. This week, we have the opportunity to gather today as church to recognize that Jesus is an unexpected king. We'll gather again on Thursday to ponder Jesus, the king who washes his disciples' feet, the servant king. On Friday, we'll gather as church to consider Jesus the King as he carries a cross, the King who gave his life for his people. And then on Sunday, we'll gather as church on resurrection morning to see the King who defeats death itself. Today marks the beginning of a week that begins in celebration and ends in tragedy, and then bursts into unimaginable joy. And every step along this week is unexpected. Jesus isn't the kind of king that they thought, and perhaps sometimes that we expect. His crown wasn't made of gold or jewels, didn't come with a sword, but was made of thorns and love. So what I want to invite you to do, not just today, but each day this week particularly, is to linger in his story, to make space, to look through the windows of Holy Week, not to lose the significance of what occurs, but to make that space and time within your life and in your story, to notice the surprising and the unexpected details of the days in between today, Palm Sunday, and next Sunday, Easter Day. So as you continue to work on your beautiful creations, I want us just to think as we're writing, drawing, colouring, cutting, sticking, about what invitation Holy Week gives to us. What does Palm Sunday invite us into? Because I think it gives us an unexpected invitation. It invites us to decide not who we think Jesus should be, but who Jesus actually is. And to ask ourselves what kind of king we will allow him to be in our lives. Whether we want him to be a king of our convenience, someone who fits neatly into the expectations we already have. Because if we do, then I think we're going to be disappointed, because that isn't who Jesus is. But he is a king who will, if we let him, transform everything. Everything about us, everything about our world, and everything about our future. As Jesus rides on that donkey into Jerusalem, he's signaling loud and clear that he hasn't come to conform, but rather to transform. And whilst the people who were lining the streets wanted saving, they didn't realize that what they wanted saving from wasn't the tyranny of the Roman Empire, but rather was their own disconnection from God. And Jesus' kingdom turns everything upside down. In his kingdom, the first are last, the humble are lifted, enemies will become neighbors, and power looks like service. This is what his reign looks like, not just then, but now. And it's what it should look like in our lives, in our schools, in our homes, in our workplaces, in our churches. And so I think the invitation for us is to consider, if Jesus were to arrive, walk down our street today, what would we say to him? Because the encouragement this week is to look beyond the surface, to look beyond the familiar, and to be able to ask some who, what, why, when, and how questions of ourselves and of Jesus. And to approach each one of the days of Holy Week asking those questions, wondering perhaps who we're expecting to meet, what it is that Jesus might want to say to us. When will we make space to listen to him? Where does he want to challenge us? How is Jesus' arrival, Jesus' life, Jesus' death, Jesus' resurrection going to make a difference to the people that we are? Because Palm Sunday is the start of something quite unexpected. It's part of the greatest story ever told. It's about a man who was fully human and yet also fully divine. It's about a king who chose a donkey over a stallion, a cross over a crown, and love over power. So we have a choice to welcome him today, not just with songs or with lip service, but with our hearts and with our lives, and to follow him into Holy Week, all the way from here to the cross, all the way to the empty tomb, all the way to his joy that never ends.